Hello, Endersword here again, this time with a short one-off video about Star Wars with the last movie up and coming here. I was revisiting this with a couple of friends, and The Last Jedi has one scene that people were upset with at the time, probably still are, about hyperdrive being used as a weapon against your opponent in space combat, and how that kind of breaks the Star Wars canon and past events. Why don't they just hyperdrive crash into everything that's large and threatening to deal with it? And I kind of have a theory on why it should not break stuff that should be relatively explainable with the canon that they already have. And I don't think I've heard this particular theory before. Maybe I'm wrong. So wanted to present it, but it has something to do with the size of the things actually involved, which are different than we've seen in the past. So things that we're used to from the original series and the prequels are things like the Star Destroyers, Mon Cal cruisers. Those tend to range between 1 kilometer to 1.6 kilometers in length. They are big, but they're a lot smaller than what we're dealing with in the Last Jedi movie when it comes to both the Supremacy and the Raddus. A normal Mon Cal cruiser is 1.2 kilometers long. The Raddus, which is the flagship, is 3.4 kilometers long. And the Supremacy is many times bigger than even the largest Super Death Star that we've seen before. So the sheer scale of things, the Supremacy is like 60 kilometers by 13 kilometers and 4 kilometers tall. So it's just dwarfing the next closest thing that we've seen in terms of a ship. And yet also key is much smaller than the Death Stars. And that's actually important as well. But it really is the size equation that matters. And I think the reason why has to do with how hyperspace is supposed to work. It's been portrayed always, and they repeat many times, the idea that approaching a gravity well can pull you out of hyperspace. They've demonstrated that with the interdictor cruisers, which projected gravity well to try and trap and pull other ships out of hyperspace, prevent them from jumping again. It's always been said that you have to get a certain distance away from objects to enter hyperspace, that you can't get too close to a planet without being pulled out of hyperspace, and so on. And the idea has always been that as you approach a gravity well, you're likely to get sucked out of hyperspace back into real space. And hyperspace is like an alternate dimension or another dimension apart from real space. But the one thing that does exist in hyperspace is they describe them as a shadow of a gravity well that exists in real space. So what is generally implied by that is that there is a certain amount of force or distance to a gravity well that must be somewhat based on the strength and size of that gravity well that would actually pull you out of space. So what I am thinking is the case is that when you approach something like a planet, the point at which you hit the strength of the gravity well such that it is enough to pull you out of hyperspace is still outside the actual radius of the physical object. So as you were to approach Earth, which is 63 kilometers in radius, it's likely, and they kind of show this in the movies, they seem to come out close to a planet, but not like right next to it, not like right in orbit, but some fair distance away. So if you were to, say, approach Earth, it may pull you out of hyperspace 7,000 kilometers away from the center of gravity of Earth, but Earth's radius is 6,300 kilometers, so you've got several hundred kilometers of space there in which you will not crash into the thing. It would pull you out before you ever crash into it. On the flip side, if you take a much smaller object like a Star Destroyer, other types of ships that we have typically seen, it's likely that they never have the mass that's actually required to pull you out. So if you were to hyperspace through them, you would literally go through them. That at no point would they have density in any point that would be strong enough to pull you out. And I think that's what makes the Supremacy uniquely different, is the Supremacy should be by volume probably close to 300 to 500 times the mass of a Star Destroyer. The Raddus is probably about 6 times the mass of a normal Mon Cal cruiser. So the masses are much scaled up from what we've seen in the past, and yet they're not so big that they're actually approaching moon, planet, star-sized as something like the Death Star 2 might be. If you look at the radius of the Death Star 2, despite how big the Supremacy is, it's probably also an additional 50 to 100 times the mass of the Supremacy. So it's going to scale up a lot bigger, such that if you tried to hyperspace into the Death Star, you would be pulled out of hyperspace before you actually touch the edge of it. With the Supremacy, we may be in a sweet spot where the moment that it was going to pull you out, the moment that you got close enough to the center of mass, you were actually in physical contact with it. And so the time that it was pulled out of hyperspace back into real space, it was literally already occupying the same space as the Supremacy was. So this type of weapon, this type of approach, could actually only be used in the first place when two things are massive enough to create the gravitational attraction, gravitational force to pull it out of hyperspace while it is in physical contact. If it was too much bigger, it would pull you out before in contact. If it was too much smaller, it would always be so weak and not dense enough to ever pull you out of it. And I think that's ultimately the key to this and why we ended up with the big boom, which was a cool shot. And I think this can stay in canon, and actually never come up again and not violate any of the pre-existing rules in Star Wars. It's just going to teach the First Order and other things to not make things of a specific size because of this problem. You can make them bigger, you can make them smaller, just don't put them in the sweet spot. Let me know what you think.